Hi.
Prominent guests to discuss the situation. One is, as mentioned before, from Hungary. Please, for the sake of everyone, pronounce your name.
I'm Zsolt, Szekeres. Very nice being here with you.
Gastón is an old friend coming from Argentina, although he is the former head of CELS, which is a very important Argentinian institution for, in general, human rights, but it was established during the dictatorship for defending the rights of the enforced disappeared people, but CELS now also works in all of, I can say, Latin America. And so we have two very experienced and distinguished guests. Let me start by saying that looking at the second half of 20th century, people would project that the 21st century could be a century of rights or human rights. That did not happen. Now, globally, we're faced with a new phenomena, which is called the shrinking democratic space or shrinking civic space. In 20th century, democracies were assassinated with coup d'etats in the hands of dictators, and although human rights and activists and the people under dictatorships suffered a lot, there was always hope for a transition back to democracy. And that happened in most of the countries where coup d'etats happened, including Turkey. Of course, with great cost. But in the 21st century, what we are witnessing now is democracies suffocate in the hands of elected leaders, which has a popular base among the people and which are elected. So that brings a new tension. Elected leaders, it's very hard nowadays for, let me say, human rights, because there is a contradiction between democracy and the so-called election-based democracies and human rights. The first thing these elected leaders, and it's a common phenomena in all of the autocratic regimes, starting with Turkey, Russia, Venezuela, Hungary, Poland, and India. I can add a few more to those, but we see that the leaders learn from each other. That should be a guidebook, because what they do generally is almost the same. The first thing they do is a sign of authoritarianism is an assault against truth or truth tellers. Because truth-seeking is a democratic process in which all of the people with a so-called freedom of speech can negotiate about what the truth is and come to a common conclusion. But with the shrinking or ending of democratic space, truth-seeking vanishes immediately, and instead of truth, the most dominant thing happens to be lies, half-truths, which are dictated by the authoritarian leaders. and because there is no space for the discussion about it, they dominate the truth. And if you think about Turkey, which is another common phenomenon, the first thing those authoritarian leaders do is attack freedom of press, either by censorships or by transfer of ownerships for pro-authoritarian, for people, actors who are close to those leaders. Parallel to this, there is an attack on the independence of judiciary. The judiciary is used as the whip of the leaders to convict, in general, all the opposition. And the most vocal parts of society, of course, are targeted. Journalists, academicians, as you know, that has been the example in Turkey, and then rights defenders and civil society activists. So these are the main targets of most of authoritarian regimes in the world. Here we represent three different, let me say, stages, because according to the Freedom House reports, for civic space and democratic space, Turkey is considered as a closed country, which means there is no space for any freedom. Hungary is considered to be half closed, and Argentina is considered to be free. So, but of course that does not mean that for a closed country there is no struggle, or for a free country there are no obstacles. I would like to start with Gastón, and so that he can give us a general view about those obstacles or the struggle for human rights in Argentina and in Latin America in general.
Thank you, Murat, very much. It's a privilege to be here, and thank you, the Rand Dink Foundation and Memory Truth and Justice Center, for inviting me for this very important and needed conversations at the festival. It is good to hear and to attend and to talk with different people from the world, particularly in Turkey, and to see that there are many challenges for democracy and human rights that we share in this part of the world, in Latin America, and actually worldwide. And it's very inspiring to be part of this discussion, and very needed, actually. Going back to your question, I know that is in this kind of global discussion is important to do comparative analysis and to find similarities between, for example, Turkey and Latin America and Argentina, and actually they are many. But let me start by differences and actually to put on the table some kind of more positive trend when we talk about democracy in Latin America and in the region. And not because there are not challenges, as you were telling, beyond Freedom House Index, that are not necessarily are that I share. But I think there are the conversation. I would like to highlight some ideas. You know, Latin America, particularly South America, we have had over the 20 centuries more authoritarian regimes, like Murat was saying, than democratic regimes. Like authoritarian regimes were the rule. And in Argentina, the last dictatorship was the most brutal in the region, along with the Chilean one led by Pinochet. Today, for example, Argentina is turning next year 40th anniversary of democratic regime without interruption. And when I say democratic regime is like free and transparent election over the year since 1983, when I was 14 years old. Colombia, 2 weeks ago, had a presidential election, and one leader from from a left-wing party, Gustavo Petro, he was a former guerrilla member of the movement M19, was elected a president for the first time. A left party took power after 70 years of armed conflict. And actually, the current president and the current government recognized the election the very same day. It was a second round election, recognized it, and they are working on the transition today. Something that we cannot say about the United States, for example. I mean, the northern democratic champion for the world, as we know. I mean, there is still the former President Trump, and tragically, maybe the future is still haven't recognized that he lost the election with the current President Biden. So in Chile, you know, I mean, this year, Boric, the current president, took power coming from a social movement, a student from social movement from Chile that that he joined when he was at the high school, and they become a political party. And after many governments from center-left and center-right that were kind of quite, they got a consensus, but they didn't address the authoritarian legacy from Pinochet era. This new group won the election. So all of this to say that, of course, there are other, I mean, so that democracy, of course, with a lot of problems, and the main one probably, as in many countries, but in Latin America is particularly the most challenging is inequality. I mean, you know, Latin America is the most unequal region in the world, and actually the inequality was strengthened by the pandemic, but in spite of many problems that we are dealing with the democratic times. Of course, we have other cases. You have, as you mentioned, the case of Venezuela, we have the case of Nicaragua, and talking about illiberal democracies, we have the most, I mean, I will say the most because the scale and the relevance, the importance of the country, the most important case that is the case of Brazil, in which Bolsonaro is a former military member and is completely undemocratic. He has he destroyed the good policies in favor, social policies in favor of indigenous people, Afro-Brazilian people, social policies, and actually there are elections in Brazil in October, and hopefully he will be unseated. And the final example, just to finish, about in some way a positive step was we had in the region a coup d'etat in Bolivia in 2019 against Evo Morales, that actually he tried to overstay in power, but that was something illegal, something undemocratic, but actually he was a victim of a coup d'etat from like a traditional coup d'etat from the military, but after less than a year, there were free elections, and his government, not himself, was back in power. The president, Anin Jañez, who perpetrated with the military the coup d'etat, was convicted because she led this coup d'etat. And this is something that I think are positive signs. I am not saying that we are in a beautiful position. There are huge and many problems, and we share a lot of problems, but I just wanted to start by some positive signs from Latin America, and then we can talk specifically about human rights and, for example, abortion and sexual reproductive rights in Latin America. That is something positive.
Thank you, Gastón. Of course, in general, when we look at the world, Latin America gives us hope, let me say, because there are more positive things we can name and see in Latin America. But let's come back to Europe now. Although, I mean, in your country, one of the authoritarian leaders, Orban, is elected again. So he will remain in power. And what are the obstacles, and what is the situation of your precious work in Hungary?
Well, thank you also for inviting me. Thank you for the organizers for having us address this panel and be here and be able to exchange ideas and be inspired by the human rights work that many of you do here in Turkey. It's a source of inspiration for us in Hungary too. And the Hungarian Helsinki Committee is one of the oldest and largest human rights organizations in the country. It was set up during the end of communism to help oversee the transition into democracy in 1989. And the main focus or the main aim of the Hungarian Helsinki Committee has been to, ever since its foundation over 30 years ago, to protect the rights of asylum seekers and refugees, which of course was fundamental during the Yugoslavian wars, which is south of Hungary, and the rights of prisoners and detained people and victims of police brutality and police violence. And there was maybe this era of optimism, I think, in the 90s and early 2000s that, you know, communism fell, democracy is here, Hungary joined the European Union, and everything's going to be fine. But everything was not fine at the end. And it also made Helsinki think about how to reorient its work after 2010, when the current governing party, Fidesz, led by Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, took power, and it was increasingly clear that they are detaching themselves from the conventional rules of constitutional democracy and the rule of law in favor of the raw power of majority. And there have been these signs of a country sliding away from democracy and back into a more authoritarian rule, happening, of course, step by step, so that it's not that easy to notice at first. There have been newly appointed judges to the Constitutional Court, for example, which over time has become a lot more reluctant to rule against the government, strike down laws which are blatantly unconstitutional because they violate the rights of minorities, for example, but are dear to the government. There have been new laws passed to silence the opposition. There have been hostile takeovers in media to silence opposition or independent-leaning newspapers, to rearrange the ownership system. And it's quite clear that, Viktor Orbán stated himself in 2014, he traditionally goes to a summer festival for conservative youth, where he delivers a big speech about his vision for the next years to come. And in 2014, he openly said that he is building an illiberal state, which still believes in freedom and such, as he put it, but it has a national character, and in such it is not a liberal one, but an illiberal one. And he himself said that there are opponents to his vision, which are civil society organizations who are funded by, quote unquote, we don't know who, so we have to make sure that they are more transparent. Now, of course, civil society has been transparent ever since the fall of communism. There are strict criteria on the reporting of our finances, income, staffing. We are overseen, our functioning is overseen by the independent judiciary, as it should be. But there started this fear-mongering in Hungarian society that there is an outside influence by unelected civil society workers who cite civil rights and the rights and freedoms of people who are not very popular in society, refugees, LGBT people, women, detainees, people in prison, and we have to look into them because they're actually political activists. That's what the Prime Minister claims since then, and I'm sure that these lines sound familiar to many sitting in this room or listening in online, since these are lines that are echoed by many other authoritarian-leaning leaders. So the work that we do has been becoming increasingly tough, but actually we're not really faced with a choice in the sense that protecting human rights is what we do. And the Hungarian Helsinki Committee, together with our NGO partners, had to rethink a lot of the work that we do and how we do it, especially when the state authorities completely cut contact with us. We had long-standing cooperation agreements which allowed us to enter detention facilities, provide legal aid and legal advice representation for victims of rights violations in prisons, immigration detention facilities, asylum detention facilities. So it made us very hard to access the people that we set out to help. New laws were put in place to repel and deter asylum seekers, of course, after 2015. And the Hungarian Helsinki Committee was put at the forefront of the government fear-mongering and hate-mongering campaign, portraying us as wanting to bring in illegal migrants. This brought us into a very negative spotlight on the one hand. On the other hand, it gave us a lot of opportunity to talk about the work that we actually do. And it gave us a lot of opportunity to make use of the international recognition that we received, well, thanks to the government, but most importantly, due to our work to still work for the fundamental rights of the people who need our help, because nobody else would help them if we wouldn't. And in this, I mean, we're going to talk about this more in detail, but I would just really like to emphasize the importance of reaching out to others and building alliances, because, of course, when one group in society is singled out, in this case it was NGOs and civil society actors, others will follow, of course, and this way we become each other's natural allies. So it would be a huge wasted opportunity, and in fact another blow for democracy if we didn't reach out to another.
Thank you. I would like to ask both of you, I mean, although our principles are the same, defending human rights, since the world has changed totally, because we have leaders, political leaders, who directly attacks human rights, denounces that this is women's rights, LGBT rights, let's say, which are fundamental rights in human rights, are not acceptable. So there is a direct attack. Should we change or think about changing how we work, how we deal with human rights? Is international and national solidarity has an impact on the work we do? Is it important, more important than it used to be? And should we change the way we deal with politics in the sense that of course, the human rights organizations have their own policies, and what they do is political, but they are neutral. I mean, in governmental or country politics, they only emphasize the values, but they do not point out any political party being, should this change?
I think that this is the question about this conversation and many conversations that are going around at the global south, but also at the global north, about our strategies. And particularly, I think it's quite important to rethink about not the concept, but the strategy of international solidarity and actually rediscuss it, because if we have in consideration the examples that, I mean, you have mentioned, I mean, we can also mention many others, I mean, Turkey, Hungary, India, Venezuela, Russia, and many others, Brazil. The old strategies that the human rights movement used to work with, the old toolbox, seems that are not working well. You know, I mean, I am coming from Argentina. I'm from an organization that was founded at the middle of the dictatorship by relatives of victims for the dictatorship from disappearance, to support the work that mothers and grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo were doing at that time. And actually, as always said, the concept of shrinking civic spaces didn't exist at that time. There wasn't any space at all. We were in the middle of the most brutal dictatorship. Of course, democratic institutions were not working at all. Free press, Judiciary, elections, unions. And no, probably you know the number. I mean, there are like 30,000 disappearances from that time. So there was a brutal dictatorship. And of course, there were not social networks. Internet didn't exist. Hardly we have analogic telephones. And mothers and grandmothers had this very simple idea to go around Plaza de Mayo with a handkerchief? English translation? The white handkerchief, scarf, thank you. And that was a kind of very simple strategy that was a basic of the international campaign against dictatorship that became worldwide known and very powerful. Of course, we are living in a very different world now, and geopolitically speaking, I mean, it's nothing to do with that. As you have said at the introductory remarks, now these authoritarian regimes are kind of weird because they got to the power by elections, and actually, I mean, for me, and of course I don't have answers because I wouldn't be here, because I will be in another place if I have the answer. The main issue is how in this geopolitical scenario we can do effective international campaigns in order to denounce, to name and shame, and to create changes in national realities. So this is one question that I think I have and still are going around, and I think this is a part of the discussion that we have to do. The second is, I think, part of this previous era in which human rights were relevant in order to do an international campaigns was yeah, we were living in the framework left by Second World War, in which international human rights were part of that part of the Second World War end, and the human rights started from the international, and from the international, the Universal Human Rights Declaration and so on, the regional bodies, the regional treaties. From the international went to the national realities, and the legitimacy came from the summit of the governmental power after the war. Actually, I think over the last 70 years, I mean, for different reasons that it's not to discuss here, or it is to discuss here, that legitimacy has exhausted. and there is no like a power using these instruments at the international level that are effective. So one of the ideas that are going around are if we need, because of course we still believe on the human rights values that are part of these instruments and part of this international architecture, we will have to rebuild the legitimacy from national to international, and not in the other way around as was before. And that connect with two other things. One is the one that you mentioned, I mean, the relationship between the movement, I mean, the human rights movement, with politics. And I think, I really think that we become too much professional, technocratical, and expert, to say a word that is a lot of use, and we become very much actors to talk to the power and to the palace. Palace means government, I mean judiciary, parliament, and we have detached from the streets, from the people, if you want. And in some way, we lost track with what were the real problems, because we were too busy trying to do advocacy on policies, but not actually trying to win elections, because we are not part of it. And so I am not talking about in a partisan way, but I think we have to rethink about this idea of, no, you know, we don't do politics. You know, we are independent, transparent, autonomous. We don't get involved in this kind of shit activities, in these kind of dirty activities, because we are pure, and you know, we just have these values and we work with this. And the second issue connected with this, I think, is a relationship with social movement. I've been in the previous panel about the grassroots activism that was very interesting, and I think we as a human rights movement, called civil society, called non-governmental organizations, or support organization, or whatever we want to call it, we have to find another place in order to connect the street with the palace, and vice versa. I mean, to bring it back and forth, and to use our expertise and to use our knowledge in order to translate demands, or not to translate, because I think it's a tricky word, but in order to work with, in alliance with different groups. And I mean, the main point I am trying to make is to build other type of power that is in the street, and not necessarily to influence the mainstream power, the institutional power. And I think to build another type of power, instead of to influence and to advocate the palace, I think we have to rethink many things about our strategies.
Thank you. I'm going to ask the same question to you, but let me put some additional points in that, because with the wars and with the climate crisis, most probably our future one of the main agendas of human rights will be refugees, unavoidably. And with the inequality going on, the other one, the global issue point is poverty. So you are an organization working for refugee rights also. And it's very hard when your leaders and your population has a discourse of pointing out the refugees as the cause of all the problems in the country. So do you have a toolbox to deal with this? Did you change your strategies? How are you dealing with it?
Yes, working with refugees has always been challenging ever since 2015, when, of course, Europe was faced with what many people call the refugee crisis. I personally don't like this term. I think it was more a humanitarian and rule of law crisis, if anything. The crisis was not that there are refugees. The crisis was how Europe and the European Union dealt with those refugees many times. And before I go on to answer the refugee-related questions, just a few points on how to reframe the general human rights discourse and whether we should, rethink our position to politics, because civil rights work is political. I mean, it is quite clear. And what we have also come to learn the hard way, that if we remain if we remain solely on the track of being the experts and the pure ones, it's not going to resonate with the people that the populists claim to get the legitimacy from. And it is true that, of course, nobody argues that, for example, the last election in April, the current governing party won. However, if you look at the lies and the changing of the electoral law, the fairness of this election can be debated, to say the least. And when we're faced with a changing civic space around us that focuses on emotional-based discussions, it's very hard to remain in the role of the neutral expert, because nobody will really want to listen to what you have to say. However, we have to keep doing the work that we do, which is to remain in the high professional level of work that we do, and bring cases to court, represent people, but translate it better and explain it better to the public, to the people that we help oftentimes. That why do we do it, and why is it good for them if we do it, if we hold the government accountable? Why does it help everybody if we represent asylum seekers who have been deprived of their liberty in a manner which is not which is against the law? Why do we help the refugees and not help, quote unquote, those who suffered because they were left behind by the economic process and the economic situation that Hungary faced? We have to reinvent this communication strategy a lot better, and just instead of always complaining or always holding the power accountable, we have to become a positive actor and explain our position, explain the value of human rights work, I think, a lot better to those who are actually in need of the human rights work that we do, but at the same time can fall victim very easily to the populist regimes who prey on their fear, who prey on their vulnerability, and instead of enable them, they push them deeper, and they also are a lot in need of the protection that the human rights work can give to them. And to the question of refugees, well, after 2015, a lot changed. And before 2015, working with refugees was seen as like a nice thing, I mean, you work with people who were persecuted, and it's challenging, but it's a good thing that you do. But after 2015, when the government also changed course and started this incredibly intense hate-mongering campaigns, saying that Syrian and Afghan refugees coming to Hungary are going to steal people's jobs, and they bring a culture that doesn't belong here, and they're somehow threatening, and they're all these single men who come to do unspeakable things with the women, and all of a sudden everybody was a women's rights champion who previously wasn't. So that really changed the discourse, and we had a hard time explaining initially why do we do this thing that many claim to be a national security issue as opposed to a human rights issue. And of course there are national security elements in working with refugees. Nobody in their right mind, I think, can question that. But we resorted to very simple storytelling. And there were a lot of human rights violations with very similar faces to the wider public. For example, the Hungarian government built so-called transit zones on the Serbian border, which were places of detention, where if after a very unjust, undue procedure which completely lacked any kind of fairness, they rejected somebody and could not deport them because for some reason, Syria or Afghanistan was not very quick to take them back in a formal procedure, they would stop giving them food. These people, refugees, were mothers, fathers, children. They were locked into a place and starved by a European Union government. And of course, we litigated, we turned to the European Court of Human Rights, which ordered that they should be given food very fast. And we told this story to the public that your government is starving people. And that resonated very well, because even people who supported the government would never stand for such brutality. And after 30 such cases, which we always made a huge fuss about, this stopped. And now with the Ukrainian war, or the war of Russia in Ukraine, it's what we see is that there is a double standard from the side of the government, that of course Hungary is a neighboring country to Ukraine. And I think now it's over, or nearly 1.5 million people who came to Hungary. They didn't all stay in Hungary, many left. But Hungary cannot not open its doors and welcome them. And then they have a hard time explaining, why do we help the Ukrainians and not help the Afghans? Why does the law say that if an Afghan refugee is found, or any refugee other than Ukrainian, found on the territory of Hungary, the law says that they cannot ask for asylum, they're thrown out to Serbia, literally to the Serbian fields and forests, often beaten, while at another border, people fleeing from the same type of war and violence, they are let in, as they should be. And there are answers, of course, to this. Of course, many of them are inherently racist, but the official answer is that they are coming directly from a war, so they are somehow more deserving of the help that we can get. But then again, there are those fleeing from Ukraine who somehow don't get the help that allegedly everybody gets. For example, the Roma population fleeing Ukraine face a very high level of discrimination in Hungary. But we still have hope for the work that we do, and that's because of the initial response of the Hungarian society, which really moved very fast when Russia attacked Ukraine. And many people opened their homes and houses to the refugees, which was a good sign that solidarity could not be killed out of Hungarian society despite the best efforts of the government. And it also presented us with the possibility to explain that why the previous laws depriving the rights of refugees are bad. Because the stories that the Ukrainian refugees now say are very, very similar oftentimes to the stories that refugees in general say. Why did they cross on the green border? Why didn't they use the border crossing points? Why don't they have documentation? Why don't they stay at home and fight? And these questions come up, and now it's more relatable for the Hungarian public to understand that the questions to these the answers to these questions are extremely humane. And nobody in their right mind, I think, would leave their children behind to catch bullets from the Russian tanks. They would flee, and that's what the Hungarians would also do. That's what many of them did after 1956. So it presents a huge challenge, of course, for our refugee work, but also as an opportunity to explain to the Hungarian public that when people flee and leave their homes, this is what it looks like. No matter if they're white or black, or if they're Christian or Muslim, when people flee, that's what happens. And that's why we have to protect them, and we have not just the legal obligation, but the moral obligation to grant them with protection.
Just wanted to say something about your previous question, because I think it's very relevant about the relationship between politics and human rights and our strategies. And I want to highlight the example of Colombia and the new president, actually the vice president that was elected. Her name is Francia Martinez. Probably you read about her because became very well known. And she is an Afro-Colombian person working from the Pacific communities, Afro-Colombian communities, and she is a housemaid, single mother of 3 kids, and a feminist and environmental activist. And she decided to participate in the primaries in this big coalition, and actually the elected President Petro in some way had to choose her as a vice president candidate because and her role there and her mobilization at the grassroots level was critical in order to win. And so she is a person from grassroots movement, and she has a feminist and environmental justice agenda, and she's now the vice president, first Afro-Colombian woman vice president in the history of Colombia.
Okay, it's obvious that although the world is changing, human rights will be a constant need, and there is more need for human rights activism nowadays under authoritarian regimes, most probably. On the one hand, with the world crisis of poverty and refugees and environmental change and crisis too. Although we are resilient and working, still it's obvious that some discussions about the human rights movement in this new era is essential. Because the attack in general and the problems are international. The language of human rights is international, but the organizations are not. So there is a challenge in this issue. So if you want to comment on it, how can we reach out and have international support or internationalize our local issues? Do you have...
I think it's very, very important, and I will be very brief about it, that in the Hungarian context at least, it's harder for the government to get away with new legislation or practices that violate human rights if they're silenced about it. I think although it is a new strategy of the populist leaders that they completely detach themselves from our previous understanding of self-restraint and shame and democratic norms, still if there is considerable public and political pressure that it would cost them too much to do something that would violate human rights, we can get them to back off. There is a very good example for this when the Hungarian governing majority intended to introduce a new system of administrative courts into which the administrative litigious procedures would be channeled into. There was a lot of international and European Union uproar, also from the participants of the private sector, the investors and the business actors who understood that if their investment cases and if their arguments about land use and land buy and labor rights cases will go into courts which are controlled by the government, then their fair procedure can be called into question. And then that also helped a lot, of course, heavily supported by the more core human rights arguments, to get the Hungarian government that controlled over 2/3 of the parliament and really with no effective opposition to back off and not do it. Of course, they're still hacking, which is a soft word, they're attempting to take over the judiciary, but this was a very important victory for the wider human rights coalition. And of course, in the context of the European Union, it's extremely important to always remind the European Commission and the Parliament that they have a job to maintain, to uphold the treaties of the EU, which are, as we heard yesterday, founded on the principles of democracy and human rights and human dignity. And slowly, because it's a slow mechanism, but it brings results. So far, Hungary is the only country in the European Union which did not receive the recovery funds after COVID, because there are systemic problems, not just with human rights, but with corruption. And this, of course, is under the umbrella of the state capture that occurred in the past 12 years. So advocacy really helps, and it can bring about tangible results and can force even the hand of the most determined authoritarian not to do something or retreat from something.
Yes, I think that this is, yes, as we were saying before, is a critical issue. How, if we have to re-legitimize international human rights framework and architecture, because the values, I mean, still are needed and we believe in them, this process will be from national or local to international. So the question that you, Murat, asked is important, and as you said, they are already, I mean the authoritarian leaders, are already playing with the book. I mean, those, I mean, Orban, Bolsonaro, Erdogan, Modi, they already have the guidebook, and I think we are still drafting it. We have to hurry up. But I think there are. I can think in a one a good, interesting example of how international, local, and national issues, that is from Latin America and from Argentina, that is the movement, the feminist movement around the issue of abortion, and you know. After 20 years of mobilization of feminist movements with plural in Argentina, in 2020, the Congress passed the law adopting the abortion for women after the 3 months. I mean, up to 3 months. And actually, I mean, for a country with Catholic and who the Pope is Argentinian, you know, I mean, it was unthinkable to have the abortion law adopted. And this movement and the feminist movement using the handkerchief, the bandana, the green bandana, become global and regional. And after Argentina, actually, Chile passed and Colombia and Mexico and Uruguay adopted similar legislation about sexual and reproductive rights. And actually, yesterday I read an article in Foreign Affairs that was writing after the U.S. Supreme Court decision in Roe versus Wade, rejecting, actually ending like an era on abortion rights for people and women and other in the U.S. The article was what can be, it was a very interesting because from a U.S. perspective, I think it's something extremely unlikely. What we can learn from Latin America, not coming from the United States, they are thinking an example that can be learned from Latin America. And actually, this was a very local issue in Argentina for 20 years with a very different strategies and tactics, political, mobilization, legal, litigation, national and international. At the end, after many failures, they succeed. And not only that, but the issue was replicated in other countries in Latin America and become, actually yesterday in another session there was a picture of these green bandanas, and so I think this is a good example, and one of the issues in terms of activism I think is very important and was very important, or was important here, but I think it should be more strategically, is the connection and articulation between movements, because the feminist movement also was articulated with the human rights movement in Argentina and with incipiently young environmental justice movement as well, in order to mobilize to approve the abortion law. So I think that this is something, the youth movement about climate justice, there are many things that we as a human rights movement, we have to reach out, as Josie was saying before, other movements in order to articulate, because they are doing so. I mean, the anti-rights, the racism guys, the corporation sector, the white supremacists are speaking together with like 3 basic ideas. And we are still working in asylum, and I think this is something that urgently we have to change.
Her ikisi de yurt dışından ve uzaktan geldiği için 1 saati onları dinlemek üzere kullandım. Sorularınız varsa çıkışta ve fuayede sormanızı rica ediyorum. I thank time during the festival in Istanbul. Thank you.